Jonathan Wells, a journalist with a reputation for not being afraid to ask awkward questions, was once assigned to write an article about an old abandoned hospital that many locals considered cursed. This building stood on the outskirts of the city, among wild thickets and broken trees, and had been attracting rumors and speculation for many years. However, the rumors were not about ghosts or mysterious silhouettes. People talked about strange sounds coming from inside, as if someone was moving through empty corridors, shouting incomprehensible words. The hospital was built many years ago and served as a shelter for patients who were considered terminally ill at that time. At that time, medical technology was far from modern, and the treatment was more like torture. People with various ailments were brought here, ranging from complex injuries to mental disorders. The names of the patients were rarely remembered, but the stories of their suffering left a deep mark. Jonathan remembered his grandfather telling him about his childhood, when he and his friends were afraid to even go near the hospital. They heard stories of those who went inside and came back with their eyes dilated, refusing to talk about what they saw. Some, however, were found later in the forest, muttering about the lights that called them. Over time, the city stopped discussing the hospital, as if it wanted to erase the memory of it. Jonathan decided to spend the night inside the building. Armed with a flashlight, camera, and notepad, he entered through a side door that defied time and rust. The dusty corridors greeted him with a booming echo of footsteps, and every creak of the floor echoed in his ears like the beat of a drum. Jonathan walked forward, the light of the lantern picking out pieces of peeling paint, graffiti, and dilapidated furniture remains. The dull echo of his every move became more and more eerie. He tried to convince himself that these sensations were just the result of a game of imagination and adrenaline, but a deep, lingering feeling of anxiety grew. In one of the rooms, behind a sagging door, Jonathan noticed old medical instruments left on a metal table. Scalpels, rusty clamps, and strange devices, the purpose of which was difficult to determine, lay in disarray. But what struck him most was a cracked leather book with yellowed pages. He carefully opened it and saw the notes made in sloppy handwriting. There was pain and fear in every line. Patient 17. The condition is unstable. Screams at night. Admits to being afraid of the light. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. He closed the book and was about to leave the room when he heard something that made him freeze. It was a barely audible sound, like the rustle of paper or the rustle of footsteps on old linoleum. He froze, listening, trying to discern its source. But at that moment, there was a sharp sound in the corridor outside the door, as if something heavy had fallen and rolled on the floor. Jonathan's heart began to pound faster. He exhaled, trying to catch his breath, and went out into the corridor, directing the beam of the flashlight towards the source of the sound. Nothing. Only the distant gleams of light on the glass of old cabinets, which reflected his own movements. And then he noticed that the door he had left ajar was now closed. He froze, his blood froze in his veins. A closed door meant that someone or something could be in the building with him. He quickly turned back. The shadow cast by the broken window fell on his face. Suffocating fear began to rise in his throat, filling his lungs with a numbing feeling of panic. Jonathan slowly walked up to the door and slowly stretched out his hand to open it, but at that moment there was a rasping sound from the other side, as if someone was running something sharp on wood. He abruptly withdrew his hand and took a step back. Thoughts of possible escape options flashed through my head. Looking around, he noticed a staircase leading to the attic. Having no idea where this would lead him, he rushed to the stairs and, clutching the lantern to his chest, flew up the creaking steps. The attic smelled of dust and rot, and the light from the lantern picked out scraps of old newspapers and wooden beams, from which rusty nails stuck out in places. He held his breath, trying not to breathe too loudly. The silence weighed on my ears, and every breath seemed deafeningly loud. Suddenly, footsteps were heard below again. Slow, heavy, as if someone or something was looking for him. The footsteps approached and then stopped right under the stairs leading to the attic. Jonathan froze, feeling his heart about to burst out of his chest. At that moment, a barely audible whisper came from the dark corner of the attic, and for a split second he thought he caught a silhouette. Someone had been here all this time, watching him. The whispers grew louder, and Jonathan began to distinguish words that were unintelligible and confused, as if someone had repeated them over and over again. He raised the lantern, pointing it at the corner of the attic where the sounds were coming from. The light illuminated an old, dust-covered doll with faded eyes and torn clothes lying on the floor. It was unexpected, but even more strange was that the whispering stopped instantly as soon as the light touched the doll. Jonathan felt a slight sense of relief for a second, but then his gaze fell on something else. Old, almost decayed papers were scattered next to the doll. He approached cautiously, keeping an eye on the stairs and doors in case he needed to escape. Picking up one of the papers, he saw a child's drawing. It depicted several figures standing next to a long building similar to this house. One of the figures stood out in particular. It was black, with painted red eyes and an ugly grin. At the bottom of the drawing were the words in a child's handwriting. "He is always here." Jonathan froze. These words seemed to be a warning, but at the same time incomprehensible, like a note from the distant past that somehow intersected with his current reality. His gaze fell back on the doll, and he noticed that its position had changed. The head was turned in his direction, although he was sure that this had not happened before. My heart began to beat faster, and an unconscious feeling of horror began to arise inside. At that moment, there was a thud from below, as if something heavy had fallen. Jonathan instinctively backed away to the opposite side of the attic, keeping his eyes on the stairs. The noise was repeated, and the sound of footsteps returned, this time faster and more decisively. Whoever it was coming upstairs. Jonathan frantically searched for a possible exit, noticing a small dusty window at the end of the attic. Running up to it, he tried to open it, but it jammed, and the wood became so dilapidated from time to time that it threatened to break. The attic door began to open slowly, accompanied by a prolonged creak. Jonathan tore himself away from the window and turned sharply, seeing how the light of the lantern fell on the empty doorway, but there was no one in sight. In the silence of the attic, the creaking of the floor underfoot reminded of the presence of an uninvited guest. His breathing quickened, and he tried to calm down to reduce his panic a little. "Hey, who's here?" Jonathan's voice faltered, but he forced himself to speak, hoping that it would attract the attention of the neighbors, if they could hear him at all. There was no answer, but a dead silence hung in the air, which was more oppressive than any sound. Jonathan turned his gaze back to the stairs. There was no one there anymore, but the feeling that he was being watched did not leave him. Finally, he decided to take a chance and rushed to the window, trying to knock it out with his elbow as quickly as possible. The glass cracked, and the scent of damp and old boards rushed into the cold night air. Barely had he made a hole big enough to squeeze through when he heard footsteps, fast and heavy, heading towards him from behind. A sharp rush of adrenaline gave him strength, and he jumped down without hesitation, feeling the shards of glass cut his clothes and skin. The fall was short and painful, and he collapsed onto a pile of debris, which muffled the impact. There was a haze of pain for a few seconds, and Jonathan coughed, fighting for every breath. When his vision was restored, he looked back at the old house. Through the broken attic window, a shadow could be seen standing motionless, like the silhouette of a man. That was the last straw. Jonathan got to his feet and limped away without looking back. Through the pain and fog in his mind, one thing became clear. What he had found should have remained hidden. Eric, exhausted by anxious days and sleepless nights, was at the epicenter of his investigation. He gained access to abandoned archives that no one had ever seriously considered before. In musty basements, among old folders and broken drawers, he came across thin, yellowed sheets of paper, personal notes of a former guard who guarded the barracks area decades before the arena was built on this site. In these recordings, the guard described hearing muffled screams and seeing vague movements in the dark that could not be explained. One of his last posts read, "They look, but they don't come out until you show fear. They are not spirits. They are people whom no one sees or knows, but they are always here. Eric felt a cold sweat running down his back. He turned around in the dim basement, listening to the muffled sounds from above. The building seemed to be breathing, creaking with ancient beams that had expired. When he returned home, he uploaded all the materials he found to his computer to analyze the data and find clues. It was then that his journalistic intuition began to put together a picture that turned out to be far beyond his darkest assumptions. In one of the video files captured by a surveillance camera on the day of the match, he noticed something strange. As the players and spectators celebrated the victory noisily, several figures in dark clothes slipped between the rows, barely visible in the human stream. The camera recorded how they approached the exit and left the arena without attracting attention to themselves. Eric realized that this was not a coincidence. These people were connected with illness and death, which covered the participants of that game. The next day, he went to his detective friend to discuss the find. He agreed to help and took out the footage from the cameras, which captured the same figures coming out of the back door of the arena, which was rarely used. Combining all the data, they found that the mysterious people were connected to a private security organization known for its harsh methods of suppressing riots. Eric decided to contact the surviving witnesses of those events. One of them, a former employee of the arena, admitted that he had heard rumors of underground deals between the arena and those who called themselves Defenders of Order. These defenders held secret meetings and training sessions, using the arena as a cover. However, the last of these meetings ended tragically. An accidental explosion claimed several lives, and the participants disappeared as if they had never existed. Eric, realizing that the case was taking a threatening turn, gathered evidence and prepared an article for publication. But the day before the material was supposed to be published, a stranger called him. The voice on the other end of the line was hoarse and threatening. "You came too close, Eric. It's not worth writing about what lies behind the facade of the game." That evening, when Eric returned home, he found that the lock on his door had been broken. Upon entering, he realized that the apartment had been turned upside down. Among the clutter on the table was a note with the inscription, "Be silent, or you will be next." Adrenaline and fear took over Eric. He left the apartment and went to the office where his detective friend was staying. However, on the way, he noticed that he was being followed. A car without license plates drove slowly behind, maintaining a constant distance. Eric turned into an alley to try to get away from the pursuit, but they caught up with him. Two men in black uniforms got out of the car. "You're too curious for your own good, Stevens," one of them said with an icy grin. Eric felt the blood drain from his face. He knew these men weren't joking. His heart was pounding so hard that it seemed to be audible all over the alley. He turned abruptly and ran, ignoring the pain in his lungs, reminding himself of himself after a restless night. He knew that if he didn't hide, the consequences could be terrible. Stumbling, he ducked into a small passage between two old buildings. The weaving of the narrow streets resembled a maze, but Eric knew that every step brought him closer to safety. He couldn't afford to stop. Thoughts raced through his head that his article might have cost him his life. However, he could feel his pursuers not falling behind. The sound of footsteps behind him was getting closer. Eric came across a metal grate leading to the basement of one of the buildings. Realizing that he had no other choice, he quickly pushed back the lid and jumped inside, closing the grate behind him. It was dark and damp inside, but it didn't matter to him. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to stop breathing. The men stopped at the bars. One of them, loud and confident, said, "Stevens, come out and we won't hurt you. We just want you to leave this story alone. Trust me, you don't want to know who you're messing with." Eric froze, trying not to breathe. He could hear them talking among themselves, discussing where he might have gone. Suddenly one of them said, "We'll check all the exits. We won't let him live. We don't have time." Eric knew that his time was running out. He began to look around. In the basement there was only old furniture, rusty pipes, and a few boxes. Suddenly his gaze stopped on an old closet. He didn't know why it might be useful to him, but he decided to take a chance. Quickly running to the closet, he opened it and found that it contained old things covered with a layer of dust and cobwebs. His hands came across some heavy object. It was an old stick, probably metal. He took it and, concentrating all his strength, sat down behind the closet, preparing to meet strangers. If they found him, he wasn't going to give up without a fight. Gradually, the footsteps began to recede, and he heard one of them say, "He must have gone further. It's time to get out of here." Eric felt a surge of hope, but he knew that this was just a temporary reprieve. He knew he needed to get out of this basement and get back to his investigation before he could be found again. After a few minutes of silence, he carefully opened the closet door, looking out. Since no one was watching, Eric decided to act. He quickly and quietly got out of the basement, trying not to make a sound. Outside, he paused, listening to the sounds around him. The streets seemed calm, but he had to hurry. As he headed for the office, Eric realized that he was alone on this dangerous path. With his new information, his life was in danger, and he had to find out what kind of organization he had affected. But how to do this if the fear did not leave him at every step? He made it to his office, trying not to attract attention. Once inside, he headed for his desk. His notes are still open on the computer. Eric quickly began sorting through his data, trying to find more information about the mysterious people who he now knew were part of some hidden world. Soon he came across a reference to the Shadow Council, an organization that controlled various parts of the city using fear and force. Their riot control methods were brutal, and their connections to rent and private security agencies made them even more dangerous. Eric realized that he was part of something much more complicated than just an investigation. He realized that he had to tell his story, not only for his own sake, but also for the sake of those who could become the next victim. At that moment, he finally decided that he would not be silent. But his intentions to make the truth public were under threat. At night, when he was about to leave the office, the same stranger called him again. "You're still here, Eric. You don't realize how close you are to danger. I can help you, but you have to trust me." Eric sighed, realizing that this might be his only chance. He replied, "I'm ready to listen, but you have to tell me the truth." The stranger on the other end of the line hesitated. "Really? Do you want to know the truth? Okay, I'll tell you. But before we continue, listen to me carefully. You can't trust anyone, especially those who are looking for you now." Eric was wary. "Who are you? And why are you helping me?" "My name is Mark. I was part of the very security organization that you associate your investigations with. I left them when I saw what they were willing to go to for power. They arrange their affairs in secret, and you are the only one who is on the way to revealing the truth. I'll help you, but we have to meet, and I can't guarantee your safety until you figure out what you're dealing with." Eric sighed, hesitating. Every cell in his body screamed a warning. There are too many questions, too many risks. But he also knew that staying inactive was even more dangerous. He asked, "Where are you?" Mark made an appointment at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Eric knew it was risky, but he had no other choice. He had prepared several things, a phone to record the conversation, and a stick, just in case. As time passed, Eric realized that he had to act quickly. When he arrived at the place, he was overcome by silence. The building looked like an abandoned fortress. The windows were boarded up, the doors were open. Eric cautiously went inside, listening for every rustle. His heart was pounding in his chest as he moved deeper into the warehouse. Suddenly, he saw a figure standing in the semi-darkness. It was Mark, a middle-aged man with a tired face and penetrating eyes. He looked like he had been through a lot. "Eric," he said, approaching. "You came. That's good, but we don't have much time." Eric quickly asked questions. "What do you know about the Shadow Council? Why are they so interested in stopping me?" Mark sighed, his face contorted with pain. "It's not just an organization, it's a network. They control almost everything in this city. Sports, politics, even some media. They do this to hold on to power. You've become a threat because they know you're close to the truth." Eric felt a chill run down his spine. "But how can I stop them?" Mark leaned closer. "You need to uncover their connections, but it's not easy. They have eyes everywhere. If you want to deal with them, you need to know their weaknesses. I can tell you about some of them, but you have to be careful." Eric was ready to listen, but before Mark could continue, there was a sharp sound. There was a loud crack, and footsteps sounded outside. "They've come for you," shouted Mark, grabbing Eric's arm. "Let's run." They rushed to the exit when Eric heard the voices of the pursuers. His heart was pounding in his chest, and adrenaline was filling him. Running out into the street, they jumped into a car that Mark had managed to park nearby. But alas, Eric soon realized that he could not trust Mark as much as anyone else. As they drove away, he noticed Mark nervously looking in the mirrors. Eric soon asked, "What happened?" "I do not know how they found out where you are," Mark said. "But we have to clean up all traces." There was alarm in his voice, and Eric sensed that something was wrong. He bent down to look through the window, and his heart skipped a beat. A black SUV with tinted windows was chasing them from behind. "It's them!" "Hold on!" shouted Mark, abruptly turning the corner. But the SUV was not far behind. He slowed down when they reached a quiet street where there was not a soul. Mark tried to evade his pursuers, but they were relentless. Eric, noticing how one of the men in the SUV got out and approached their car, shouted, "Mark, look!" Without waiting for an answer, Eric opened the door and ran out into the street. He understood that now, perhaps, this was his only chance of survival. Rushing into the alley, he felt the adrenaline rush over him again. He knew that there were screams and sounds of pursuit behind him, but right now he had only one thought: to get away from his pursuers. He ducked around the corner, then turned again and found himself in the shadows. Looking at the chase, he no longer thought about what he was doing. The only thought in his head was to get out and find out the truth. But suddenly he was caught. He ran into a group of people dressed in black uniforms. "Eric Stevens?" one of them asked with an icy grin. Eric knew this was the end. He was trapped in this dangerous world, and no one was going to save him. "You have the right to remain silent, but we have our own methods." Several men gathered around him, and Eric realized that he was in a complete hopeless situation. But then, when it seemed that hope was finally lost, Eric remembered what Mark had said, "You can't trust anyone." And maybe he still had a chance. He quickly turned around, preparing for a last attempt. The moment one of the men stepped forward, Eric, using all his strength, rushed at him, causing the others to be surprised. The whole situation turned into a serious fight. Eric fought like never before and, using his resourcefulness, managed to break free from their grip. Eventually, he broke out into the street, losing sight of them. It was getting dark, and Eric knew he needed to find shelter urgently. He understood that hiding wasn't enough. He had to find a way to expose them. Eric was on the move, looking forward, when a sense of determination gripped him. He knew that he had been looking for the truth all this time, but now she was looking for him. He was on the verge of a revelation that could change everything, and his story was just beginning.